In the 20th century, a new power was discovered, a way to control not just what people did, but what they wanted. At the center of this story, a man called Edward Bernays.
Would be as important weapons as anything. In the United States, every idea that wants to establish itself depends on public consent. And so we worked out the engineering of consent.
He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he believed that democracy was far too dangerous. If the masses were allowed to think for themselves, God knows what we might do. Now, Bernays studied his uncle's theories of the unconscious mind, that beneath our rational selves lived a darker world of hidden desire and fears. But where Freud sought to understand these drives, Bernays sought to exploit them. He called his new profession public relations. But others had a different word for it: propaganda. In 1929, Edward Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company. At the time, women were forbidden from smoking in public. Cigarettes were a symbol of male power. Bernays staged an event at the Easter Parade in New York. A group of women lit up cigarettes, declaring them torches of freedom. The newspapers called it a protest for women's liberation. But it was not a protest. It was theatre. It was very carefully staged illusion. Overnight, women in America began smoking, not for freedom, but for profit.
At the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
Now think about this. How often have you seen somebody doing something and you think that this is somehow a testimony of liberation, and you've got up the next day to do it without any thought? Is there something in your life right now that you feel very passionate about, but you're not really quite sure where it came from? Think about that one. Now, Bernays' success was not just in selling products. He showed corporations and, unfortunately, governments that the public could be managed. He helped to sell the First World War to Americans as a fight to make the world safe for democracy. And later, he advised presidents and corporations alike how to manipulate the crowd whilst convincing them that it was their own choice. Now, by the early 1950s, Edward Bernays wasn't just selling cigarettes. He was advising corporations with vast land holdings in Guatemala, the United Fruit Company. Now, when President Jacobo Arbenz introduced land reform under Decree 900, threatening United Fruit's monopoly, Bernays stepped in.
I was only 7 years old when my father was overthrown in the coup organised by the CIA. I remember having to hide under the bed during the bombing. My parents did their best not to worry us, but we soon realised how serious things were and the dangers that we faced. Guatemala was a very backward country, based on a colonial, almost feudal system. One of the first things that my father, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, did as president was to bring in reforms to modernise farming. America's United Fruit Company, which had enormous economic power in Guatemala at the time, didn't like the changes. They became very upset when they saw that their monopoly was being affected. This was the time of the Cold War, so they took advantage of this to label my father a communist, which was totally untrue. And that's how they promoted and justified the idea of an invasion.
Aircraft parachute meager supplies to the pasture airstrip as the rebel drive to oust the red-tinged government bogs down. The shabbily clad, poorly trained troops striking from Honduras overran the sleepy town of Esquipulas.
In internal memos, we see Bernays urging a scientific approach to counter what he framed as the threat of communism. What is needed, he wrote, is the same type of scientific approach that is applied to, let us say, to a problem of fighting a certain plant disease. Now, at the same time, the CIA Operation PB Success, a covert operation to overthrow Arbenz, and Bernays' campaigns linked United Fruit's interests to the American fear of communism.
This is the Kremlin, citadel of Russian communism. Looking at Russia, we might see it as a country to be studied, as we study other nations of the world. Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world. Why so? What makes it a threat? Looking closer, we see a clue. Public display of giant portraits of communist leaders. These leaders, by their actions, have caused the world to stand guard. Here, in Russia, you see the reason why so many nations are building up their defenses.
In 1954, Arbenz was forced to resign. Guatemala descended into decades of civil war, but United Fruit survived, and Bernays had proven something extraordinary. With the right words, with the right image, you could literally topple nations. Now, what Bernays created was more than propaganda. It was a new way of controlling society, not by force, but by desire. By making people feel free, even as if they were guided invisibly towards the choices others wanted them to make. Now, out of this came modern consumerism, a world in which people no longer bought things that they needed, but because they wanted those things, and what those things said about them, keeping up with the Joneses, was created. It was about their identity, it was about their dreams, it was about their fears. Now, Edward Bernays died in 1995, but his vision remains. It is there every time you turn on a screen, every time you see an advert, every time you believe that your desires are your own. The truth is, they may not be, and that they probably actually aren't. They may be the product of a century-long experiment in manipulation, an experiment that began by a man who called himself the engineer of consent.